Hello, a very warm welcome to the penultimate session of this year's Anne Lister Research Summit, Lister's Web Interweaving Personal Collections in Anne Lister's Social Circle. We're joined by an expert panel of Summit Squad members and packed with potential contributors who have dedicated much of their time delving into the lives of Anne Lister's network of women. We have Chantel, who is going to speak around Mariana, of course, and of Tib too. We have Marlene, who's going to speak about Anne Walker and a little bit of Mariana too. We've got Kat, who's going to speak about Sib and Mariana, Madame de Rosnay and Maria Barlow. And we have Steph, who's going to speak to Tib and Eliza, Tib and Miss Valence and Emily Norcliffe. You will hopefully have seen the graphic as you were joining the session that really demonstrates the complicated network of women in Anne Lister's social circle. We're only going to touch on a limited area of focus with the time that we have today. So we're not going to cover everything in that network. We're going to start with some questions for the panel, but do post any questions that you have into the chat during the session, and we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A. So without further ado, in terms of social circles, how frequently did the women in Lister's life overlap? I get the sense that many of them were perhaps already friends before Anne Lister was brought into that circle. Chantel, could you tell us a little bit more perhaps about Mariana, Tib and Anne being at school together?
Yeah, so there's actually quite a lot of evidence that these women overlapped before and of course after Anne arrived on the scene. And so to start, there is a myth about Anne and Mariana and Tib knowing each other from the Manor School in York, but based on the timing of letters and other pieces in the timeline, so we know that's not necessarily the case. For example, like focusing again on the Belcombe and the Norcliffes, we know that there's a letter from Mariana to Tib in 1809 where Mariana talks about her time in Scarborough. So obviously that's before Anne and Mariana and Isabella. You can tell by the way she writes that they have a very, very close connection. She calls her dear Bella. One of my favorite letters is from Tib to Anne in August of 1810, where Tib writes, I had a letter this morning from my darling and utmost adored Mariana, who is quite well and is enjoying herself very much. Most sincerely do I wish you knew more of her. In my opinion, it would be impossible for you not to like her. So that being dated 1810, we know that Mariana and Anne have not met yet. And knowing that Anne went to school in 1805 at the Manor School, that they would not have attended school together. So those connections between the Norcliffes and the Belcombes happened, obviously before 1809. And then one other point, there's a letter from Mariana to Thomas Norcliffe in 1812 toward the end of that year, asking if Charlotte can extend her stay with the Belcombe family. Which indicates a close relationship, right, between the families beyond just a friendship of Tib and Mariana. She's actually, writing to him asking if Charlotte can stay longer. So those bits right there just show that connection before Anne existed in a much greater way than what we, might have assumed or known.
Sure, that's great. Thank you so much. Kat, I'm wondering about perhaps Vere Hobart and the MacLeans.
So you've got a lot of familial connections between sort of people related to Anne and then people elsewhere, and I'm certainly not going to go into all the connections in my 1,200 people sized MacLean family tree. But so you've got Vere Hobart, who is Sibella's niece, and Sib is referred to occasionally by Vere as her second mother, owing to the death of Sibella's sister in 1804. And she was then raised by the MacLeans, though we know she had a guardian as well, as Sullivan, who was an uncle, I think. But you've also got other familiar connections in there. You've got Anne Walker and Sibella MacLean share a reasonably close connection through the marriage of Sibella's sister to one of Anne Walker's cousins. Well, Sibella's sister to the wife of one of AW's cousins. There we go. You've also then got possible family connections, which are a little bit more complicated. You've got Madame de Rosnay. So she was in Paris in 1824, and that's when Anne met her. She was sharing an apartment with a Miss Gauntlet, who is described in a very roundabout way by Anne to be a friend and relative of the James Dalton's friends, the Hills, sister to Mrs. H, who is sister-in-law to Mrs. H, Mrs. James Dalton's sister. I have not worked out how that works, and I can't find the connection relevant in any tree research, but anyway. And then looking kind of outwards away from those family tree connections, you've got the MacLeans in York in December 1819, and they clearly socialised within that York circle, at least enough for Mariana to be able to introduce Anne to Sibylla at a party at the MacLean residence in February 1820. You've also got the Cromptons, who are friendly with the family, although more so with Breadalbane, and Sibylla writes, "The Cromptons I know but slightly, owing to my health while in York, but they are intimate friends of Albane's and M. Macdonald," Margaret Macdonald being Sib and Albane's cousin. And there is actually a piece of existing correspondence mentioning Anne, you might be aware of in the Crompton collection at Northallerton, so that's a really interesting connection there as well.
So many connections, and I think perhaps complicated is a bit of an understatement when you connect all those familial connections and social circles. Did they seem to be aware of this mutual connection to Anne Lister? Marlene, could you tell us a little bit perhaps about Anne Walker and what she knew?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because if you read the part of the courtship and go forward and then jump to the letters, especially letters around 1834, there is a part of 1834 in which Mariana keeps writing to Anne Lister to sort of making her come back. And at some point, Anne Lister's like, "I will tell my wife you are doing this." But there are letters from Mariana to Anne Lister, some from July, some from October, that are not exactly subtle. So she would have an idea that Mariana means quite a lot to Anne Lister, because she's also part of those letters, either on copying them or she writes half and then Lister writes the other half. So you get the sense that she is not blind to what's happening, and it would be very, very. You'd need to be very non-observant not to realize that something was there beyond just regular friendship, because the way those letters are written is not what you'd say just oh, it's just my friend. I mean in a contemporary way we write a different way than they did then, but even accounting for that, she would still need to be very oblivious to not notice, because especially if she's copying stuff that was sent directly from Mariana to Anne Lister. And of course later on she also reads Anne Lister's correspondence, and occasionally there's one or other that jumps to her, but those are very brief mentions from Anne Lister, so we cannot go too deep with those.
Super. And I think we've got some examples of those letters from the archive service that are going to be being popped into the chat by our Summit colleagues, if anybody's interested in seeing the content of some of those letters that were copied by Anne. That's great. How about Tib, Chantel? What did Tib know?
Oh, so I absolutely love the web between the Belcombs and the Norcliffes and what Tib and Mariana knew and all of that stuff. And so we do know from journal entries that Mariana and Tib knew about each other, before Anne came on the scene. And so this is mentioned in multiple areas through the years. But for example, in November of 1820, Anne writes about telling Miss V that, quote, "Soon after my acquaintance with Mariana, told her how Tib and I were situated and the nature of our connection." So right there, she, literally says it out that it was known. And then, of course, there's also multiple mentions throughout the years of the Belcombe sisters knowing or suspecting each other of having something going on with Anne. And of course, Mariana was the one who always seemed most aware of that. But it's interesting to see that all the mentions throughout those years. And then in 1820, December of 1820, this was another time that Anne was at Langton, and she says she was spending time with Mrs. Milne and then went to Anne Belcombe, where Nance says, "She told me of my attention to Mrs. Milne and that I had taken no notice of her or Miss V, and that she was sure Miss V had observed it and felt it as she did." And so even right there, Nance being jealous of Mrs. Milne, and we know Mariana was jealous of Nance, and then Tib throughout all of this is just kind of on the side, knowing that all of these things were going on while knowing about her and Anne and Mariana. So These were just, you know, a couple of those entries throughout the years where we know that they either knew about each other or had big assumptions about each other.
A little bit of vying for attention, perhaps. I get the impression of from some of those entries. Steph, how about Miss Valance? What was happening there?
Yeah, so I'm glad that Chantal mentioned the Langton Hall incident, and I think that period is so important in terms of like making the explicit connections that, you know, Anne Lister had with these women just visible in the journal, because, you know, some of the other comments can be kind of vague. So Eliza Rain, you know, calling Tib, you know, your partner of future years, or even that, you know, Tib or Anne telling Mariana about Tib and how they're situated and like the nature of our connection. A lot of people can read that as like kind of vague, and maybe they think like, oh, it's like a Boston marriage kind of thing. But the Langton Hall portions, like Anne goes to stay with the Norcliffes in 1818 there after Emily Norcliffe died, and then later again in 1820. And on both of these visits, Mrs. Valance is present. And they do a lot of walking on the wold, having confidential conversations. And the things that come out in these conversations make it really obvious that like they are having like discussions about exactly what is going on. So Miss Valance tells Anne basically that she has been having an intimate relationship with Tib and had previously potentially her sister Emily. She makes a comment to Anne about how Emily wished her to do as Tib had since made her do. And in a different conversation specifies that like Tib was playing the man to her. And there's an incident where Anne like is grubbling Miss Valance downstairs on the sofa, and Miss Valance tells Anne later that Tib had told her she wanted Miss Valance to do to her as so Tib wanted Miss Valance to do to her as Anne had done to Miss Valance on the sofa Tuesday. And then there's a few conversations too where Anne is trying to convince Miss Valance to come to Shibden as her mistress, and she's really kind of upset about that, both about like being second place, but also you know, says she's upset about the idea of displacing Tib. And then if that meant that she had to cut with the Norcliffes, because clearly that was a close familial connection there. And then they also have Anne and Tib have a conversation where they're in bed talking about, Tib is telling Anne how Miss Valance is the only one that she'd ever met in her life that aside from Anne, whom she could love. And then in relation to Tib, there's also a connection with Miss Valance sends a letter to Anne in 1825. And it's kind of insinuating that Tib is potentially hooking up with Isabella Dalton or Belle Dalton, who I think is her cousin. But she talks about Tib's passions being ungoverned, and Anne kind of speculates after copying a bit of this letter that like Tib perhaps grumbled her, she can do no more. So they were definitely having knowing conversations about these relationships that were going on in this circle.
Yeah, sure. So if we've got that kind of evidence then that those conversations were happening and they're knowing of all these different connections and relationships with each other, I'm wondering about jealousy and whether that existed in these relationships. Do we have any evidence for the fact that perhaps we get a sense of jealousy? Chantel, have you seen anything that would suggest that?
Yes, when it comes to Mariana and jealousy, I think they go hand in hand. So just about every single woman that Anne is a close friend with through the years, there is some mention made where Mariana is jealous or says she is jealous. And so, and you know, I think Mariana knew enough about Anne, obviously, as what we've all said before, that she wasn't just being friendly with these women. And so like a couple examples out of the many. So like in December 1817, Anne is with Mariana again and writes that Mariana was in tears about being jealous of the attention that Anne is giving Lou, like, you know, Lou, her sister. And so, you know, she does have these very varying levels of jealousy, whether it's attention or actually jealousy in areas of like Mrs. Barlow and Nance, in those areas where and Mrs. Milne, where she knows it's more than just a little bit of attention. And so like another example, in February of 1820, Anne is with Mariana And she gets a letter from Miss V, and says that Mariana has 1,000 jealous suspicions, and perhaps after all, I must show her the letter. I read her a little of the ends, which she has taken seriously, and declares, if I get into any scrape with anyone but Tib and my friend Sarah Binns, she will never let it cost her what it may have anything to say to me again. So right there, again, another good example of Mariana knowing about Tib, but Mariana, her jealousy saying, like, if you do anything with another woman besides these two that I think you've done things with before, I'm not going to be happy. So she definitely had that jealousy constantly flowing when it came to Anne and other women.
Sure. Kat, could you talk to perhaps Sibella and understanding with Mariana perhaps?
Yeah, so following on from Chantel there, there's definitely jealousy as well between Mariana and Sibella, but it sort of switches as the 1820s progress. So right at the beginning, when Anne is first sort of flirting with Sibella and they're kind of getting on with each other, in 1821, Anne writes in her diary, a blank half sheet enclosing a leaf torn out of her pocketbook containing, according to my request, a written promise that if I would visit them in their island of Col in the year 1833, that she would return with me to Yorkshire. Mariana came up to me and seeing this written promise was very angry at my folly in extorting it, and a jealous fit almost knocked me down, but we soon made it all up. So I think it kind of summarizes just how angry Mariana was about Sib, and I think it's quite funny as well because Mariana is the one that introduced Anne to Sib in the first place, so she's very like, actually no. But that does definitely shift a little bit, and as we kind of go through the 1820s when they're in Scotland together, Anne and Sib, Anne talks very incessantly about her plans for her future with Mariana for when Charles dies, and it's a recurrent theme, and it's very much sort of, every time Anna can mention it, she does. First day, it's like, oh, by the way, when Mariana's dead, well, when Charles is dead, I'll be living with Mariana. And Sib's like, oh, okay. So it switches a little bit. And then in London in 1829, Sibella confronts Anne about it, very much in a, you were pining for Mariana and I was right here and willing to do anything and everything for you. And Anne writes in her diary of that argument, she knew what she, Miss MacLean, was. My mistress, I suppose she meant. She would have promised me anything when I first got to Edinburgh, but I soon told her how I was situated towards Mrs. Lawton, and she had thought I went over on purpose to tell her this, for I certainly did not speak like an engaged person at Esholt. Esholt is an 1824 visit to the Crompton residence where Anne and Sib were kind of more intimate for the first time, but not quite so far as to go to grubbling, but there was kissing and that sort of thing. So it does, but it's quite funny when Sibella's traveling to London in 1828. Anne delays her meeting with her by ends up being about 6 months, but she says that Mariana says you can go stay with her for a bit, and Sib's like, no, thank you. She's, no, definitely not.
Excellent. So I think the answer to that question is definitely that there was definitely some jealousy there that's existing, with Anne right at the centre of it. Marlene, I'm wondering about perhaps Eliza Raine. Is there anything around Eliza and Mariana?
What isn't around Mariana and Eliza Raine? So there is one letter that's catalogued by the archive. I urge you to write to them and ask about it, in which there's a snippet about Eliza Raine designing Mariana's tomb. Apparently she didn't sketch much of quality, but she definitely made an impression with that Mariana tomb. Which is not a good thing to do when you are technically under care by the physician that is trying to figure out if you are actually a lunatic or not. So don't go overboard on designing people's tomb like that. So if the letter includes the tomb or not, I cannot tell you. Ask the archives. I'm sure they will know.
Awesome. That sounds very interesting. And I think we've got a link to that if anybody's interested in contacting the archives, so that you have the reference for that too. That will be in the chat. Thinking back to some of the sort of what you were talking about earlier on in the session, Marlene, around kind of Anne Walker being aware perhaps of some of the nature of the relationship with Mariana. Was there any jealousy there? Is there anything that exists to suggest that?
Yes, there's a journal entry from 1834 in which Anne read a letter that Anne Lister was supposed to send to Marianne, and then she says, I saw she didn't not like the conclusion, and then she quotes, "Thank you again, my dearest Mary, for all your good wishes and kindness about me and mine. The heart that has truly loved never forgets. Very affectionately yours, and especially very affectionately and especially yours, Anne Lister." And then she goes to Anne Walker, "I said that I knew what she was thinking. It struck myself too that the poetical quotation was equivoque, and I would write the letter over again. I see Anne would soon be jealous without care on my part." I mean, yeah, he just basically says, "I loved you once and I will continue to love you," and your wife is standing right there reading your letter. What did you expect? What did you expect? So essentially, there's a certain level of decorum that she has, that Anne Lister has, but then the obvious stuff seems to go past her, like, woo. So anyway, this is one good example of that. There are others if you go look further, especially when in later years she sometimes say, "Oh, she's jealous," or she may be jealous, but this is a very Lister-centric perspective. So what happens in the late 1830s, not accounting for the bits that are covered by Anne Walker, but they have a very good tendency to drama, and they don't communicate like any I don't want, normal is not a good word, but anyone would try to communicate and say, "Hey, you did something stupid, don't do it again." And she keeps doing it, and she continues to think, "Oh, I am right," so it doesn't improve, and then she gets silent treatment, and then it goes. But jealousy is a thing that happens here and there from both sides. So
that's great, thank you. Steph, you touched on Langton Hall. I think some of those entries are a little bit infamous now to those who are familiar with them. What's going on there? Is jealousy coming through?
What isn't going on at Langton Hall? Yeah, there's definitely some jealousy. I mean, Chantal mentioned, Anne is there with Miss Valence and Tib, and there's already a little bit of jealousy. Like Anne is kind of hopping between beds between the two of them, and she tells Tib one night, even that she's going to go stay with Miss Valence the next night because Tib's cousin came. And she says, Tib took it very well. I bade her not tell. She said she should never tell my amours. I fought the word amours, and she bade me never tell her if I had any. So they're kind of having a conversation around it without having that conversation. Like, Tib knows why she's going to Miss Valence's room the next night. And then, of course, like Chantal said, then the two Belcombe sisters come over and join the Langton party. And then Miss Milne is getting all the attention, and Anne writes about how she's hanging over her at the piano, paying her marked attention. And the others notice that. And Belcombe complains to her about how much attention she's giving Miss Milne. Miss Valence complains to her about how much attention she's giving Miss Milne. So there's little jealousies when they're all interacting like that. And then I think another, since we're talking about Langton and the Norcliffes, another entry that is interesting to me to mention is the connection between Miss Valence and Emily Norcliffe before she passed. So when she's walking on the wold having these conversations with Anne, she kind of reflects and basically says, like, in short, Emily was in love with her. And she describes her passions as being most violent, worse than Tib's. So potentially, indicating that Tib is also a very jealous person. And Emily was jealous of Dr. Oburn, who had been courting Miss Valence, but Emily allegedly vowed she would never marry and said Miss Valence was the only one she could live with. And so when she's telling Anne this, Miss Valence says that she thought her death a happiness, and that Mr. Norcliffe knew enough to think so too, which maybe, kind of gives a hint that, like, Mr. Norcliffe had an idea of what was going on here with the jealousy with Emily Norcliffe and Miss Valence and her suitors that she had.
Wow. Okay. I'm just thinking, can we get some clarity there, Steph? You mentioned around Tib's cousin. Are we talking
not the cousin who was troubling,
or are we talking
actual cousin?
Actual cousin?
Yeah, different uses.
Right.
Yes. Tib didn't have her cousin Belle Dalton in bed with her. She was having her menses.
Sure. No, that's super. I'm going to just I'm going to move us away from the jealousy and move on to something slightly different. And I'm going to ask each of you if you could share a favourite example of an instance where two or more of Anne Lister's acquaintances or lovers interacted directly. It's quite clear there's quite a broad range of examples, but what are your favourites? So Chantel, let's go to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, so one of my favorite times is when Tib is on holiday with Charlotte and Mrs. Milne. So of course, Charlotte's her sister. Mrs. Milne is Mariana's sister, and we know Charlotte and Mrs. Milne were best friends. So they're all on holiday together. And this is July of 1832, and this is in a letter that Tib writes to Anne. And so she's explaining their holiday, what they've been doing, you know, like their normal correspondence of where they've been, what they've seen. And, you know, she writes about their travel so far, and she says that Charlotte and Harriet are gone to the bay to seek for shells, but I preferred staying at home as the day is hot and I do not much relish stooping. So even just this small little interaction, knowing that these women that, you know, we see through the lens of Anne's eyes, and she sees herself as the center. These women are off doing something together, but then we get to see this awesome side of Tib's personality, where she's like, hey, I'm off on vacation having fun, but yeah, I don't feel like bending over, so I'm not going to spend the day with my friends. Like, it's one of my favorite little snippets into the world outside of Anne and their personalities like that.
That's a really good one. Thank you. How about you, Steph? What's your favorite interaction?
Similar to the confidential conversations that were happening on the wold at Langton, I also really enjoy so in the 1820s, there's a lot of interaction between Anne and Frances Pickford, and Pick kind of confides in Anne about, you know, other instances where she's put on regimentals and flirted with women. She tells her about a relationship she had with a Miss Threlfall, and one of my favorite interactions with like Pick is actually later in 1834. Anne Lister and Anne Walker are in Paris, and they pay Miss Pickford a visit, and she's there with her friend Miss Maitland, who there are little mentions throughout the journal of Miss Maitland, where she's mentioned traveling with Pick in Geneva and Italy. Anne recognizes her name from a book that Frances lends her, and says, you know, makes a comment like, because of the nature of the book, that I take her to be as blue as yourself, kind of referring to Miss Maitland as like a blue stocking, like, you know, she says Pick is, although claims to not be one herself. But anyway, so Anne Walker and Anne Lister pay a visit to Miss Pickford and Miss Maitland while they're in France. And when you put those little pieces, those connections of, you know, the other time that like Miss Maitland or Miss Threlfall is mentioned in connection to Pick throughout the journals with this particular visit, it kind of gives you, like, it paints a picture of like a 19th century lesbian double date with these two couples that are just like traveling around together. So I kind of like that little incident when you take into account other mentions in the journal. So
yeah, sure. Double dating, excellent. How about you, Kat?
Oh, okay. Mine also includes Tib, because we all love Tib. So in 1824, Sib wanted Anne to persuade the Northcliffes to go to Quainish on the Isle of Mull with her, but Anne went to Paris instead, because, you know, some you know, you have venereal disease to cure, which takes precedence, which is fine. So in her journal, Anne writes, wishing me to persuade the Northcliffes, supposing me to go with them to spend a week with them, the Macleans at Quainish. And then Sib's quote, which is, I like much the thoughts of your friends coming with you the first time you visit me. So in the end, Tib, Charlotte Northcliffe, Miss Valence, and also Mother Northcliffe, she went too, but they left her somewhere while they went to Quainish, and I don't know where they left her, somewhere on the Scottish mainland. So it's quite sweet. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall during that trip, because there are several quotes that kind of follow it that I absolutely love. So there's, Anne quotes a piece of Sib's writing in a letter, and she says she could have sat and wept like a fool for an hour when the Northcliffes went. And then Sib's quote, I feel quite an affection for Miss Northcliffe and Charlotte. Also, Miss Valence is a sweet and interesting girl, and her affection for you would win my regard, independently of her own worth and gentleness. Thank you, dear friend, for introducing me to such delightful people. And a very funny comment from Anne after that is, how is it she has not thought Tib masculine? Which I do quite like. I think that's quite funny. You also get Tib's quote, which is, it's actually incorrectly attributed to Anne in Steidella's book, but never mind. It's kind of difficult because it's written to different people by Anne. But yeah, So I perfectly agree with you about Miss McLean, who is one of the most ladylike, pleasing women I ever met with in my life. I have seldom seen manners that I prefer, and when seated at the head of her own table, she is perfect. And the last one is also a quote from Sib, which is to do with meeting Tib, and it says, "It was great to meet someone who thinks of you as I do, and yet differently." So yeah, I would have liked to have known what they talked about. Yeah.
I think lots of us would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in many, many, many of those situations. Great, thank you. Marlene, last but not least, how about you? What's your favourite example of that interaction between these women?
We'll still get there, but I can give you one of the interesting ones from other situations that don't necessarily involve walkers. So there's Marie Barlow during a period in Paris when Anne Lister is traveling, and Aunt Anne is there alone. There is a lot of talk about vegetable teeth. So the woman literally wouldn't shut up about the freaking vegetable teeth, and she went there and she checked on Aunt Anne, and she did other stuff, but the vegetable teeth intersected with Madame de Rosny because Aunt Anne was fixated that Madame de Rosny had bamboozled her with vegetable teeth. So then nobody would shut up about the freaking teeth. And I can tell you that I have learned more about that sort of thing than I hoped to learn ever. But you know, that's the life of a researcher in a way. So you find funny things.
Sure, I think we've all got those things we'd rather not have learned about in this this field of research. Am I right in thinking there was something to do with finances and Maria Barlow?
Yeah, so you have so when Anne is in England, as Marlene was saying, and Mrs. Barlow is still in Paris. There's a quote from November 1828, and it's when Mrs. Barlow goes back to Paris, she'd spent some time in Guernsey, and she will give my aunt all necessary assistance, and that does include sort of like furnishing her with money if she can, and if not, Anne would send stuff over. But I think Aunt Anne was definitely quite partial to Mrs. Barlow. She says she would like to give her a piece of plate, something useful and not very expensive. But yeah, they seem to be quite good friends, and there is definitely a bit of a turf war at one point between Mrs. Barlow and Madame de Hosny, because Aunt Anne says she would where is the quote, because it is quite funny. It is, "Oh, your poor aunt with tears begs of me to remain to triumph over Madame de Hosny." So I think Aunt Anne might be a little bit in on the drama there as well, which is quite funny.
Excellent. Getting all of the family involved. I'm going to move us on. I'm very conscious that I want to make sure we've got as much time for questions as we can, but there is one thing that I'd really like us to dive a little bit deeper into that we've talked about already, and that is the dynamic of Anne Walker's friendship, if there was one, with Mariana Lawton, and kind of what that seemed like based on the evidence that we have, and whether that, how did that evolve? Was it something that sort of developed over time, perhaps? And I'm thinking maybe Marlene and Chantel, you might have some insight into that.
Chantel, want to do the brief bit and then I'll go into detail?
Yeah, I'll start. So when it comes to Anne Walker and Mariana, I do think it's very important to point out that pre-1834, there is a lot of times where Mariana has made comments about, you know, whether jealousy or indirect comments about Anne Walker. You know, of course, she's coming to terms with her and Anne Lister's relationship coming to an end. Post-Christmas 1834, once Mariana realizes that things have ended and Anne Lister and Anne Walker are together, that the way Mariana speaks about and to Anne Walker or refers to her is very, very different. So you can actually see that shift, whether it's in letters or even how Anne Lister talks about it. Yeah, post-Christmas 1834, you can actually see a connection, or whether you define it as a friendship or not, but a connection and a mutual respect for those two women growing over the years. Like, you know, Marlene could go into more detail about those, but that shift is very important, and you see how things progress after that.
Yeah, so Mariana visits them at Chibden Hall in November of 1836, and during this visit, it seems like she finally realizes that, yeah, this is here to stay, and what Anne was telling her is actually what she should have assumed was from the start. That doesn't mean she won't still try to make Anne Lister tell her that she still loves her or something like that. But then Miss Walker comes into play, and then they sort of form a sort of bond. A few during that time they talk about stuff, namely, and Lister discusses the plans to alter Shibden Hall. The matter of the East Tower comes up, and then she essentially, Mariana and Dan Walker are like, nah, don't do it. So in the journals from 11th of November of 1836, she writes, then went to Mariana and Anne and somehow began talking of the plan of the house. Mariana joined Anne against building the East Tower. This led to a long discussion. I gave way, said that observations were good, and the East Tower should be given. I'm assuming she meant she be given up. Then they thought I gave up my own way too hastily, and I'd better think about it. I said I saw the thing clearly, and my mind was as satisfied as it could be with the 10 days consideration recommended. So essentially, they told her, "Don't do it." She thought, maybe not, and they were like, "But you are giving up too easily. That's not ideal." So essentially, this is one example in which Anne Walker and Marianne are in agreement, and essentially shows that if they had an adversarial relationship, this wouldn't be a conversation that would be likely to happen, even under a polite truce, because these are two women who one has been very deeply entangled with Anne Lister. The other one is starting to get to a somewhat level close to that. So they are in different parts of their relationship with Anne Lister, and it shows one that already knows her very, very well in a very intimate way, and the other one that's starting to get to know her in a more intimate way. And then later on, during that holiday, it's obvious that they have developed a friendship, because Anne Lister writes in her journal, Mariana really likes Anne, and the liking is mutual. So if they were fighting each other, this definitely wouldn't happen. But I think it's important to note that Anne Walker also sort of made sure Anne Lister was distracted during that period, because almost every day there's a grumble and the kiss. So essentially she's like, mine, and making sure she knows that. Later on, that there comes another example of Mariana doing something good for both Anne Lister and Anne Walker. So she's in New York in early December of 1836, and eventually she and Anne Lister gets talking there, and Mariana tells her about a conversation that she participated in, and it goes something like this. Mariana took me upstairs half an hour to tell me the York scandal. Mariana and Mrs. Henry Belcombe had come to high words about Anne and me. Mrs. Henry Belcombe's abuse had been more than Mariana could bear. Isabella Norcliffe, too, had not spared us. I took it so quietly, Mariana seemed rather astonished. Mrs. Henry Belcombe declared, and Miss Bagshaw, too, that I had told them, both present and at the same time, that I was sorry for Lady Ribblesdale's marriage for Anne. And Anne and I were going to spend some time with her, but their marriage would prevent it. I simply and quietly answered, I could not accept for such a mistake, for I really did not know Lady Ribblesdale by sight. The two ladies also declared I had said I ordered my letters to be directed to the Honourable Miss Lister. What nonsense! I told Mariana. It was all quite incorrect, but it was not worth a thought. Thought I, what a set of people. The less we jostle each other, the better. So essentially, they all joined each other in bad-mouthing Anne Lister, and then Walker, and Mariana was not having it, so she went for them. And apparently corrected it. For reference, that Miss Bagshaw is the nosy post office lady who allegedly read more stuff than she should. So essentially, they were thinking that they had proof for the gossip when it could probably be something else. She was not pleased. Mariana really, really went for them. Anyway, that's basically it.
There's brilliant, loads of examples there that demonstrate that kind of relationship, that friendship that evolved between the two of them. We've got quite a lot of questions that have come through, understandably, around some of the things that we've discussed. So I'm going to move us on to that, get to as many as we can in the next 15 minutes. And we've had a question from Penny. Now, Penny has said that they are the fourth great aunt of, no, let me get that the right way around. Penny has said that Maria Alexander is their fourth great aunt, who Anne had an affair with. And Maria tends to get overlooked. And do any of you have an idea as to why that is?
I think it's simply that at the time that Anne is journaling about those years when she is tutoring Maria Alexander with flute and things like that, and there's an entry where she has Miss Alexander on her knee in front of Eliza, and there's like, you know, a comment on a little bit of jealousy there. I think the main issue is that there's not as much. So Anne wasn't writing as much or in as much detail during those journal entries as she does later. And so a lot of times the entries that mention Miss Alexander are like one line about like, you know, visited the Alexanders today, things like that, like just quick little things. So I think it's simply just not having enough to analyze.
Yeah, sure. I'm just thinking perhaps, Penny, if you're interested, Hat with Potential do have profiles on lots of the individuals, and if you wanted to get in touch and work with them on a profile for Maria, then absolutely do that. So the email address and contact form are easily accessible on the website. I'll move on to the next question from Anna. Anna Clark. The discussion of the intertwined sexual relationships also raises the question of a common awareness of same-sex desire and sex, making Anna think that Anne Lister may have known that she wasn't as unique as she thought she was, or at least there was a network of women who had sex with each other, not just Anne and her separate lovers. What do we think? And that's open to anybody.
I agree with that, because those are the connections that I've been drawn to, is when it's obvious that this is happening in other relationships with other women in Anne's own journal. She's the one documenting these things. But it's interesting that she's so adamant about like refusing to identify similarly in those situations. So I understand that she doesn't want to identify as a blue stocking, you know, because there's kind of a negative connotation around that. And so there are friends of hers that might gossip behind her back and call her a blue stocking. And she gets, you know, whiffs of that from other people when she's visiting. And she gets wary of being too closely associated with Miss Pickford because of that, because people see Pick in a certain way. But she does the same thing too when she talks about instruments of Sapphic artifice. And like, she's aware of these terms. Like she's reading reviews about like Sappho's poems in a gentleman's magazine and things like that. So she's very clearly aware that she's not unique in those terms, but she still, I mean, writes to her own journal about how she is and how, you know, no one is like me and things like that. And so it is interesting. I don't know if any of us could answer that other than Anne Lister about why she didn't connect with those other examples or individuals of this, like, you know, that she knew of. So
yeah, I what you said, Steph.
That brings us quite nicely into the next question, actually, from Sarah, which is we know that Anne Lister and Maria Barlow discussed terms such as Sapphic. Do we know if any of these other women use that similar language?
I don't want to hog all the answers, but I will say, I think the conversation, one of the conversations where Anne uses the word Sapphic herself is in a conversation with Anne Belcom. And she's telling Anne about herself, her nature, like, you know, her desires, like explaining herself to Anne Belcom as she's hooking up with her while they're traveling with Mariana and Charles Lawton on their honeymoon. But in that instance, I think Anne is the one using the word, because she's describing, you know, a Sapphic instrument that she thinks, I think she's like heard a rumor that a woman in Ireland has gotten one stuck. And but again, she's kind of bringing it up in a way of separating herself from that, saying like, but I'm not like this because I don't believe in that. That's artificial. Like she doesn't want to be using other tools or instruments. Like she wants to be near her partners with her drawers off, or, you know, grubbling using her hands rather than other instruments.
There's similar discussion as well between Anne and Madame de Hosny during that period at the start of 1828. There's definitely some mentions of Sapphic and Sapphism in there, but I think again it's Anne kind of distancing herself from that, and there's a mention of again nuns using, you know, fake implements, and Anne's like, that's not me, I don't do that. That conversation definitely exists in there as well.
Livia asks whether there's any examples of Tib, Mariana, or others mentioning people that Anne doesn't know. So people that they're involved with, but that Anne doesn't know, or mentioning, so any examples of Tib, Mariana, or others mentioning people that Anne doesn't know to her that they are involved with, or never gets to meet eventually, at least.
I will say one of the things that I would love to find out is more details around Mariana's life before Anne, because that's one of the things that I haven't seen anywhere, is whether or not Mariana did have connections with another woman before Anne, or if it really was just Anne, because obviously Anne knew about, you know, Willoughby Crew when that came along later. But yeah, knowing people outside of that when it comes to Mariana, I have not seen anything or any mention of other people from her side.
There's an entry that I'm thinking of, and I was trying to see if I could find it quickly, but I'm not pulling it up. There's an entry where Anne is talking about Tib having been staying in a hotel somewhere in bed with another woman, like, or having gotten into bed with another woman, and the woman is frightened and thinks she's a man. And you know, this is like third-hand information that she's copying into her journal, so like we don't really know the context of like, was Tib trying to get up to some shenanigans with this woman? I don't know. And like, was the woman just like pretending after somebody discovered them that like, oh, I thought she was a man? Like, we don't know those things, but that's a mention that came up just in terms of thinking about, and Anne did know Isabella Dalton because the Norcliffes and the Daltons were family, and Anne was friendly with the Daltons, so she knows Belle Dalton. She, as far as I'm aware and have seen so far, has not been herself intimate with Isabella Dalton, but knows about this potential relationship with Tib and Belle.
Suzanne had asked, oh, we're bringing Anne into the 21st century. Do you think, and this is for anybody who would like to kind of answer, do you think that Anne would have had a chance to survive in the times of social media?
Definitely not as like a any sort of important figure cancelled immediately. I don't think that would have.
Yeah, she would have been caught. She would have been, yeah, they all would have found out very quickly. And also her ego, I think, would have, with social media and Anne Lister's ego, I think it would have just been an explosion waiting to happen.
Yeah, sure. So we think that Anne would probably have been cancelled then.
And Mariana would be like deep diving into the back years, like accidentally liking things from 6 years ago because she's trying to go back and find every single thing that Anne
gets caught out by that double tap.
Yes.
I think we have evidence for that. We've already talked about the evidence of Mariana's kind of jealousy, and that is it, isn't it? It's scrolling through a few years back, and the double tap catches you out. No, sure. Okay, right. We're gonna bring it back then, back into their time period. And Liv would like to know if any of these girls who had such good relationships, we've seen already from the conversations that they all kind of had very close relationships, and whether that was kind of more intimate or not. Could they go to each other's funerals? Like, is that something that they do? I think Marlene, is that a hand up there? You want to come in on this one?
Yeah, well, they might have if most of them didn't outlive her, and I think in this matter is just a burden of proof, so to speak, because traditionally at that time women could attend funerals, but it was more common for men to attend funerals. So when you get funeral cards and all that, it's usually men that get them. However, in Anne Lister's case, she attended quite a few Lister funerals. I don't recall if she attended others, but at some point in the early 1830s, when she's in Paris, someone sends her an invite to a funeral, and she's like, should I go? And everyone else is like, yes. And I don't think she went, but I think the letter with the invitation is still part of the Shibden Hall collection. In case of Anne Lister's funeral, I cannot tell you. I like to think that maybe Anne Walker attended. Whether anyone else did or not, I cannot tell you, because there seems to be no solid records of that. As you know, the Anne Lister's funeral is a black box for us still in many ways. But what's interesting here is that when she had the opportunity to attend funerals of family, she did go. So it's a break in the tradition, so to speak, in which men were traditionally the ones who went. She sometimes stood there like any other male members. Sometimes she goes with her father. When her father dies, she goes alone, or with Anne Walker, if I remember correctly. When Aunt Anne dies, it's more or less a similar thing. In other cases, it's very hard to tell. For example, you could think that Mariana went to Anne Lister's funeral, but we don't have any way to prove it. Same thing for Tib. Chantal, if you'd like to jump in on any of those, I'm pretty sure they all outlived her.
Yeah, I'm not talking about Anne Lister's funeral, but I do have two pieces of evidence to add about the funeral. So when Tib died in 1846, there is a newspaper article about her funeral, actually, and it lists several of the people who went. And Steph Belcom is listed as an attendant who went to her funeral, and the only other people listed are males. There are none of the other women who would have been alive at the time. So like if Mariana went, her name's not there, but her brother's name is. And then one other piece of evidence is in a letter from Mariana to Anne Lister about when Mr. Duffin died. And Mariana actually, there's a pretty long part in there where she talks about Mrs. Duffin says she's going to go to the funeral and do something else in regards to the funeral. But Mariana points out that even for the wife to go to the funeral seemed odd, and how she was trying to sway Mrs. Duffin to not attend because that was just not what she should be doing. So yeah, all of those pieces of evidence show that Anne Lister might have been different for some of her family members' funerals, but it wasn't common for women in this group to go to these funerals.
Yeah, so society perhaps dictated the fact that no matter how much they wanted to go, perhaps that just wasn't something that was commonplace and that they're able to do. Okay, so we've got a question around kind of Eliza, who we've touched on very briefly. To what extent did, this is a question from Jackie about Eliza. To what extent did Eliza interact socially with Anne, Tib and Mariana? Do we have evidence that they spent time together?
Yeah, I don't know. Chantal might be better to speak to this, because I know you just know so much about Mariana.
I don't know about her connection.
There's some of the there's an early trip to Bath, I believe, where Mariana, Tib, and Eliza are all attending. I might be confusing two different Bath trips. There's a second one though, where Anne is returned to Bath. I think the Norcliffes are there again, and that's the one that people tend to mention because Eliza wasn't necessarily invited. She kind of went down on her own and wasn't there with this group attending some of the same maybe social events or being called on like the others. And so before a certain period, yes, she was involved in that circle of friends. She was the one that was in York society before, Anne Lister. Anne Lister was in Halifax, other than when she was attending the manor school, and they kind of flip-flopped, and then she stayed with the Duffins in York while Eliza was in Halifax. So Anne's introduction, I think, to York society came a little bit after Eliza's.
Sure. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to just try and get through the last couple of questions. Taking us very briefly back to funerals, Sarah has said that, am I right in remembering that Lister kept a vigil for some of her family members before their funeral? And was that something that perhaps was more normal for the women to do rather than attending the funeral itself?
Well, I can take that. Either in society it's normal or not, you have to ask someone who studies the social aspect of that. But in regards to what Anne Lister did, and I just writing that. She did spend some time by both her uncles and her Aunt Anne when they died. In case of Joseph's, yeah, it wasn't a nice one. She has a very graphic description. In James Lister's case, she spent some time with the next to the remains of her uncle, and before the coffin was sealed, she told the servants to take one last look at his master. So essentially, she asked him to specifically look at him one last time. And there are some notes around in the journals in which she says that she spends some time in the room where the remains of her family members are. But you know, it's never a pleasant experience. Some people apparently did that, some people didn't, but in funerals it's more common to be the men. The women, you know, you have to look at the conventions of the society of the time and have a look and compare.
Sure. Perhaps a topic for next year's summit. If there's clearly a little bit of interest in it.
Funerals.
Final question, Marlene, this is one for you, that you are named in this question, so I'm going to direct this to you. Marlene, did Mariana and Anne Walker remain friends? So this is from Kate. Kate thinks that she's read it somewhere. Do we have any evidence for that?
Yes, in later years, well, they corresponded about stuff like the church charities and stuff like that. And Mariana usually sends her best to Anne Lister and Anne Walker. And then when they are in the Pyrenees, Mariana writes to Anne Lister and comments that she thinks Anne must be a little Hercules because she climbed the Pic du Midi d'Ossau. So there's clearly an interest on both sides. Pleasantries are sent from both ends, but it's a very casual conversation. And when Mariana visits Shibden, they are all pleasant to each other. And one time in 1837, Mariana visits Shibden and finds Anne Lister in bed, sick, with wearing Anne Walker's nightgown. And when Anne Walker comes back from Cliff Hill, she finds Anne Lister not in bed where she left her, but actually talking with Mariana and Mrs. Milne, and they have an interesting time just chatting for a little bit. She's always happy to see Mariana visit them, and when Mariana cannot make it in 1839, she is annoyed that they don't get to see her. And funnily enough, if Mariana had made it, it would be the last time they would see each other in person. But there was a sort of hurricane around that time, and Mariana didn't stop at Shibden Hall on her way to York. And obviously they didn't know, but that would be their last missed opportunity. And then Anne Lister dies about a year or so later.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We're going to have to wrap up. So we're coming to the end of the session now. So thank you so much to everybody for joining and for all of your brilliant questions. A huge thank you to our experts from the Summit Squad and Packed with Potential to bring all of this fantastic research to light about these women. Please come and join us for the next session, which is the Peak Party. That's the final session of the Summit weekend for this year. And hopefully we'll see you over there in due course. Thank you ever so much for joining.